All right, so by default, when you're entering the color page, the keyframes window is going to be minimized like this. So it's not going to be taking up as much room. Now you can expand this by hitting this button in the top right corner over here. Now it's taking up a lot more space, and typically when I'm doing any kind of keyframe work, I like to expand this just so I have more space to play around with. Now we can see that our primaries are gone and we just have our curves, but if we want to go back to our primaries, we can just switch back and forth here. So when we're expanding our keyframes window over here to the right, we are losing our ability to see two different correctors at the same time, but we can just easily switch between them up here. We just can't see two of them at the same time, which is totally fine, and that's never actually been an issue for me. Now, one really fun thing about the color tab interface is you can go up here to workspace and turn on dual screen. And now one of my other monitors is being used to show me the keyframes window and a bunch of other things. So let me show you what's happening on that other monitor. If I go to workspace, change my primary display to color LCD, that's my main MacBook, we can see this is what I was seeing on my other monitor. So in this case, we have the keyframes window filling up the entire frame from left to right. So to me, this is a much more appealing way to play with my keyframes. It gives me a lot more space to work with. So when I'm working at home and I have my dual displays on, I'm definitely going to turn this on and do my keyframing work in my second monitor over here. Now for this lesson, that's not going to work. So we're going to go back up to workspace and I'm going to change my primary display back to this one, and I'm going to turn dual display off. So this keyframes window down here in the bottom right is where we're going to be doing all of our keyframing. Now the first thing I want you to understand is that each one of these tracks is created for a new node. So every time we create a new node, a new track is going to be created. So if we go up to our node graph area over here and we hit Option S, we can see a new track has been created. It's called Corrector 2. So if we create one more, Option S, we can see a third one has been created over here. And the reason these tracks are created is so that we can make individual keyframe adjustments to individual nodes. So like I've said before, when you're working with nodes, you want to create one adjustment per node most of the time. So knowing that, we want to have the ability to keyframe those individual adjustments on those individual nodes. So that's why we have these individual tracks over here to individually create keyframes for each node. Now I want to bring your attention to the very far left over here. We can see we have these white dots, and these dots are basically just a different way for us to enable and disable our selected node. So if I go to my first node over here, we can see that we have a curve applied to it. So if I disable this first corrector over here, we can see that we're basically disabling that node. This is pretty much the same thing to just going to the node here and hitting Command D to disable it. And then we're pretty much bypassing that node overall within our node graph. Command D to enable it. And I'm going to go into my curves over here and just reset this curve. Now next to that white dot, we have this lock button. And when this is enabled, it basically just locks that node so you can't make any changes to it. So if we wanted to make some kind of changes to it in the curves over here or anything else, we can't because it's locked. So this is the same as just going to the node over here, right clicking on it and selecting lock node. So we can lock and unlock our individual nodes either up here in the node graph or down here in our keyframes window as well. So this could be useful in certain situations where you're keyframing multiple different nodes and maybe you're happy with the keyframes that you've set on one of the nodes and you don't want to accidentally add more nodes or change them. You can just lock that individual node and then you'll know that those keyframes are safe. You don't have to worry about them. Now, next to the lock button, we have the automatic keyframes button. So when we select this, we are basically telling the program that we are ready to start recording keyframes to that individual node. So when we enable this, it turns red. So now we've basically said we are ready to start recording the changes that we're making to our first node over here. So why didn't it create a keyframe when we first selected that? Well, that's because we've just turned on the ability to start recording changes. So if I was to make a bit of a change to this curve graph over here, we could see right away that a keyframe has been created. I didn't even change anything. I just clicked this dot up here. So a keyframe has been created. Now, this isn't the way that I would go about creating a keyframe. The way that I do it is with the shortcut Shift X. So now that we've created a keyframe at this point in our timeline, why don't we move forwards in time and make a change to our curves graph over here. So if we increase the brightness like crazy, now we can see it's added another keyframe and it's showing us these lines between those keyframes to illustrate that this is a dynamic change between these two keyframes. We are animating between two different values between these two keyframes. Now there's two different types of keyframes. There's dynamic keyframes, which is what we're using now, and there's static keyframes, which is something I'll be talking about later on. Static keyframes, in my opinion, are not that important. I've never actually had to use them before, but I will be sharing what those are later on. Now, if we go back to the start over here and we press play, we can see that exposure change animating slowly between this point and this point. Now, take note, when I press play, we're not getting a live update on the tool that we've used. Like, this isn't animating along with the playhead over here. If this was live, then we'd be able to see that curve gradually moving over here to the left, but it's not. We can see it kind of just snaps into place as soon as it moves past that last keyframe. So that's just something to take note of. Not necessarily that important, but we can see that the correction tools we're using over here do not update based on that animation path here. So if I'm at this point in my timeline, we can see things are very bright, but the curve is still flat. So this doesn't really reflect what's actually happening at this point in time. Not until we actually go to that last keyframe, we can see the curve jump up into place. So not too important, but just something to keep in mind. Now, next to our automatic keyframing button over here, we have this expand button. If we click on this, we can see all the different parameters we're able to keyframe within our individual node over here. So as we can see down here, we've created a keyframe for the color corrector. So this is the parameter that records any kind of color correction changes we are making to our node. Now, what if we want to create keyframes for a completely different parameter of our node here? So let's say we wanted to create a window for this. Let's create a circular window, and right away, just by clicking that circular window button, we can see that we've added a keyframe to the circular window parameter here on our track. Now, if we move forwards in time and I move this window over to the left, we can see it's automatically generated another keyframe to record where I moved this window at this point in time. So if I go back here at the beginning, we can now see this window moving as well as that exposure change. Now, this isn't a good example of where I would actually use this. This is just for demonstration purposes, but we can see down here in our keyframes window that we've created multiple keyframes for multiple parameters of our node. And if we look at the master track up here, it's showing us all the keyframes that are found down below. So this is something to take into consideration. This master track is going to show us all the keyframes, not just for all the parameters for each individual node, but for all the nodes themselves as well. So if I collapse this and I open up the second corrector over here and I make some keyframe changes over here, so let's make sure that automatic keyframing is selected as well. And we'll go up here and select our second node. Why don't we create a window over here as well? Actually, Command Z, I'm going to move to a different point. So let's create a window over here. And let's move it down over here. Now, if we close this, we can see that all of our keyframes in both of these tracks are being reflected in the master track up at the top. So up here in the master track, I can grab any of these keyframes and move them around. It doesn't matter if it's in the first track or the second track. I'm able to move those individual keyframes around up here as well. So I'm just going to delete everything that we've done here by selecting all of these and just hitting delete. I'm also going to reset each one of these nodes here. And I'm going to disable automatic keyframing over here. So the shortcut to create a dynamic keyframe on your timeline is Command left bracket. So when I hit Command left bracket, we can see that we've added a keyframe to every single one of our tracks. So that means that we've created a keyframe for every single one of our nodes. Now, most of the time, you're not going to want to work in this way because you don't want to create a keyframe for every single node in a lot of situations. Because if I open up one of these tracks now, we can see that we've created a keyframe for every single parameter within every single track. And a lot of the time that can be overkill. So that's why DaVinci gives us a couple different interfaces that we can work with here in the keyframe panel. So I'm just going to select this keyframe up top here and delete it. And that's going to delete everything underneath as well. Now over here, we can see that we have three different options. We have all, color, and sizing. So in my workflow, I've only ever really worked with all in color. But when we have all turned on, then when we create dynamic keyframes, they're going to act in that way. So if I hit Command left bracket, we can see that we're creating keyframes for everything. Now, if we have colors selected, we can see that we are presented with this green bar. And this just represents what node is selected. So if I select the first node, we can see that the first node is selected. Third one, third track is selected. So with the second node selected and the green bar in the second track, if I use that same shortcut, Command left bracket, we could see that we've created a keyframe for only that one node or only that one specific track. We didn't make a keyframe for every single track. So actually in most situations, I'll find myself working in the color interface here just because it's overkill to create a keyframe for every single parameter of every single track. Now, if we expand this track, we can see that we've created a keyframe for every single parameter within this track. Now I'm going to select that keyframe up here at the top and just delete it, and it'll delete everything underneath. So if I wanted to create a keyframe for only a specific parameter here, what I can do is actually select the individual parameters like this. So now that we're working in the color interface, I'm able to do this. So let's say I wanted to create a keyframe for color correction, and I wanted to start things off with no color corrections. So what I can do is make sure that the color correction parameter is selected. The green line is right here, and I can hit that same shortcut, Command left bracket, and we've added a keyframe to only this one parameter. So this is great. This keyframe is now acting as a placeholder. So we don't have to actually change any of the parameters to add a keyframe. We can just use that shortcut. And by the way, I actually have another shortcut for creating a keyframe in the color tab, and that is Shift X. And I personally use that shortcut because it doesn't require me to use both hands on my keyboard. So I'm gonna hit Command Z there. So we've successfully added a keyframe here. Now, if we move forwards in time, we can make changes to our curves over here, and there's no new keyframe being added, and that's because we don't have automatic keyframing turned on. So there will be situations where you won't want to work with automatic keyframing turned on. You might want to just manually add in your keyframes like this. So what I can do now that I've made a change to my curves graph over here is to add another keyframe. So same shortcut, Shift X or Command left bracket. And if we go back to the beginning and press play, we can see that animation happening. A regular value over here, I'm actually gonna brighten this up so it's more extreme. We're gonna go from a very bright value over here to a much darker value over here. So this was just another way to add keyframes, but instead of turning on automatic keyframes so it records it right away, you can add them in manually by using that add keyframe shortcut. And of course, you can also right click on the parameter itself over here and choose add dynamic keyframe over here. So one really important thing to notice is if we go up to our node graph over here, we can see our second node has this little keyframe badge on it. And that just tells us that there is some keyframing being done to this specific node. So that's awesome because then we can get an idea of which nodes have keyframing done to them and which ones don't just by looking at our node graph over here. Now, if you've worked with keyframes before, then you know that typically you want to make a smooth transition between your keyframes. You don't really want things to be linear. And by default, within the color tab here, when we create keyframes, it's going to be a linear transition from one value to another. So if I'm just going to delete this third keyframe here because it's kind of pointless. So over here, the transition from this value to this value is very linear. It's very abrupt. We're at this value this entire time, and then we're gonna automatically start changing right there, and then we're gonna hit that last value. And the thing is, when you're doing color animation like this, when you are keyframing color correction, it's gonna be harder to see, like it's not as abrupt as making a position change or like zooming or keyframing like your scale. With position and scale keyframing, you'll see that abruptness a lot more. So with this, it's definitely not as abrupt, but the color tab does give us the option to change how we animate between both of our values here. So what we can do is click and drag over top of both of our keyframes here and right click and select change dynamic attributes. Now we can see that this is a straight line representing a very linear transition from one value to another. So what we can do is actually just bump both of these values up to 2, and we can see we've created a much more gradual, flowy transition from one value to another. So this curve represents a much smoother transition between the two values. We can click OK, and we can see that the image in our preview changed a little bit because of the change in the way that we're animating between those two values now. So we're still doing that same animation, but things are just going to be a lot smoother now. Now, obviously, it can be a pain to have to do this every single time. Right click, go to change dynamic attributes and change this setting every single time. So what's really cool is we can actually go down here to our project settings in the bottom right corner. And if we select that and we go to general options, scroll down to Dynamics Profile, we can change both of these values to 2s. So these are the same numbers that we just saw when we were changing the way that we're animating between the two values back in our keyframes window, except this is the defaults. So remember, the numbers that we chose were 2 and 2 to get that smooth transition. So we can change these to those same values, 2 and 2, click Save, and now if we make another change here, if we add some new keyframes to our color corrector, so why don't we hit Shift X to add a new keyframe here, and let's scroll over here and we will brighten this up, hit Shift X again. Now, if we select both of those keyframes, we right click, select Change Dynamic Attributes, we can see that it's already applied this curve to it because we've changed the default settings within our project settings. So that's awesome. I definitely recommend you do this because 99% of the time you're not going to want a linear change between your values. Most of the time, this kind of a smooth transition looks the best. So making this your default is going to make things look a lot better and save you a lot of time. So I'm just going to press OK. Now I'm just going to delete all of these keyframes that I just made over here, and let's reset our nodes again. Now, the last thing I want to show you guys are static keyframes. So up until now, we've just been making dynamic keyframes. There's also static keyframes, and the shortcut for a static keyframe is Command right bracket. So if I hit Command right bracket, we can see that we've created a circle instead of a diamond here in our keyframes window. Now, basically, a static keyframe is basically just an abrupt change. So I've created this static keyframe here. If I go before that static keyframe and I make a change to my curves over here, like that, let's see what happens when I move to that static keyframe. We can see that we are jumping from this value, from what I've done here in the curves. And as soon as we come into contact with that static keyframe, we are snapping back to that original value that was over here. So within the DaVinci Resolve manual, it says that this can be good for situations where you have like a rendered clip that has a bunch of different scenes in it, but you haven't cut them up. So you can use static keyframes to make adjustments to individual clips. But that sounds kind of unnecessary to me and honestly would make things a bit more complicated. I'd rather just cut up my clips in the edit tab by using the scene cut detector and then just, individually making changes to clips over here instead of using static keyframes. But either way, I still wanted to share this with you guys so that you know that static keyframes are an option if you ever want to make abrupt changes like this. And of course, you can create this same kind of effect with 2 dynamic keyframes. They would just have to be very close together to have that abrupt feeling. So I'm going to select this over here. I'm going to delete it. And the last thing I want to bring your attention to is that this timeline down here reflects what clip you have selected in the clips area over here, right? I'm just going to reset this curve here. So we could see that from left to right, I'm spanning the duration of just this one clip here. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that if I'm in my timeline node graph over here, this timeline down here in the keyframes window no longer reflects just this one clip. It's showing me the entire timeline over here. This is important to understand because if you forget that you're working in the timeline node graph up here, then you're going to be making keyframe changes to your overall timeline and not to the individual clips. So that's just something super important to remember. Awesome, guys. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson. There's definitely a lot of very valuable information in this one. Definitely recommend that you guys change that default setting in your project settings because that's going to save you a lot of time. But that's it for this lesson. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new, and I will catch you in the next one.